Now we're on to a source-based question. How useful are sources B and C as evidence of the reasons for the USA's blockade of Cuba in October 1962? How useful, not how reliable, but what information, what can you ascertain from the source? What makes it worthwhile? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your own knowledge. Okay, unless you use both and support the inferences you're making from the sources with your own knowledge, you won't score highly. Remember, there's 3 different bands, okay? 3 different levels are going to mark you at. They'll put you in the middle level, and if you evidence your points, you'll go up higher into the higher level 3 band. These two sources, source B from a television broadcast made by President Kennedy on the 22nd of October 1962. The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked, ultimately leads to war. We will not prematurely risk a worldwide war in which the cost of victory would be too high. But neither will we be back down if the risk of war has to be faced. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt this secret, reckless and provocative threat to world peace. So this is a broadcast by President Kennedy in the run-up to the immediacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Source C is an aerial photograph of the Cuban missile sites. This photograph was labelled and published by the American Embassy in London on the 23rd of October 1963. When you do this question for real in the examination, you're going to have about 2 sides to fill up. So you've really got to make a sustained judgment as to how useful both sources are. You've got to make sure you surpass the level 2 element of assessing the contribution of the sources can make to the specific inquiry, i.e. the reasons for the USA blockade of Cuba in October 1962. You must provide a developed consideration of the usefulness of the sources, which takes into account an aspect of its nature, origin, purpose. For example, how representative, authoritative and reliable is it? The focus must be on what difference this aspect makes to what the source can contribute. It is not enough to say it's reliable, unreliable, typical. You've also got to think like P paragraphs. Once you've made your point, you have to evidence and explain it and use your own knowledge to support what you're saying about the source. That's the highest way. If you combine your own knowledge and the sources, you're going to score highly. Here's an example. They are both very useful because they provide us with valuable information. Source B tells me that the Americans were very worried about what the Soviet Union was doing in Cuba. More than that, we know from source B that the Americans thought that Khrushchev was deliberately trying to upset the Americans because it says provocative. Source C tells me that there was something in what the Americans were saying because we can see the missile sites in the photograph, so it supports the reasons for why the USA blockaded Cuba. However, although this is useful information, I'm not sure that I'm entirely comfortable with either of these sources. Source B is a broadcast to the American nation. Obviously, Kennedy is going to use this as an opportunity to persuade listeners that his policy is right and the Soviets are wrong. That's why he calls the placing of the missiles provocative and says the Americans are backed up by the lessons learned in the 1930s. Though it is true, US spy planes had photographed Soviet missiles in Cuba. So I've used a source there basically to back up why I'm very, very cautious with just claiming that source is really, really useful. I could go on further and say we can see those missiles in the photograph in source C, but I think it's suspicious that these photographs are issued by the US Embassy and labelled to show exactly what the Americans wanted them to show. So although they give us useful information, we have to be careful to consider if that information is trustworthy, because we've looked at the content of the source and who has made it, the author, and therefore it could be biased, couldn't it? So we've put a limitation on it there as to just how useful it may be, the same way we've done with source B. I hope that's useful, using quotes from the sources, developing paragraphs, making your point and explaining, clear paragraphing all the way through with a summative, a summing up conclusion means you should write 2 pages, and you should score a high level 3, which is 8, 9, 10 out of 10. Okay? You must recall knowledge here. You must show that you know about the reasons for why the USA blockaded Cuba in October 1962. You know that in 1962 the USA's U-2 spy planes detected Soviet missiles in Cuba. From Cuba, these missiles could be used to attack the US cities with very little warning. This is why it was an imminent, massive priority for President Kennedy and the US government. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba. All Soviet ships were to be stopped and searched to prevent further missiles being transported to Cuba. I suppose the photograph backs that up. Okay, and the speech as well. That Kennedy was serious, the speech in Source B. Kennedy demanded that Khrushchev withdrew his missiles and be prepared to invade Cuba. The Soviet ships steamed onto Cuba. The world was on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Future misunderstandings between the Soviet Union and the USA had to be avoided, so a telephone hotline was set up. The point I'm making is you need to show this knowledge and apply it so when you're judging just how useful sources B and C are in evidence and reasons for the US blockade of Cuba in October 1962.